and welcome to my easy to understand guide to Humans, the TV show, and representation. This video is relevant for you particularly if you are an Educast A-level media studies student, because Humans is a set text for the component 2 paper. In this video I'm going to be focusing on a representation of gender, age and ethnicity, but you can look at representations of lots of other things as well. So we're going to start by looking at the representation of gender. Have a look at the representation of women in this episode. There are some reasonably counter-typical representations of femininity. We have Laura, who's a kind of working parent. She's obviously got quite an important job. We see her wearing suits. We talk about her on cases. And she goes away, she travels a lot for work. And she's leaving her husband at home to do the childcare. So quite powerful representation of Laura as a parent. Mattie, the teenage daughter, you know, she's quite sarcastic, she's quite aggressive. We see her with a gun at some point as well. She's obviously very intelligent. You know, they talk about her hacking into systems. She's very good on a computer. So again, representing, you know, female characters being intelligent and quite strong and empowered. However, it's kind of interesting to look at it perhaps in a bit more depth. You've got Anita, who is obviously the female synth. You know, she's basically domestic staff, so her job is cooking and cleaning and laundry and childcare. So, you know, very, very stereotypical representation of gender there. Niska is literally a kind of sex toy used in a brothel. So her job is to entertain men for their pleasure and you know, there's no concern really by the brothel owners for her own safety or welfare. So women being represented as sexualised by male customers. And it's this idea that's a fairly typical representation of women, either domestic or sexualised. And that ties in quite well with Van Zoonen's ideas if you're studying her as one of your set theorists. Even though Laura is obviously a working mum and like the breadwinner of the family, that idea that she's the one bringing home the bigger salary and doing the more powerful job, she's failing as a parent. Her kids don't have a great relationship with her. Her marriage is breaking down. You know, she doesn't really get to spend time with her children, and her teenage daughter hates her. So there's this implication that whilst she is a strong, empowered woman and her job seems to be going quite well, her relationship and her family is breaking down as a result. So it's this idea that women can't have it all. You know, you can't be a successful mum if you are successful at working. And that is quite a common stereotype about women in work and employment. If we have a look at the representation of men, and we'll see how that ties in and balances with the representation of women. So we see Joe, and the first few scenes that we see him, he's obviously doing a lot of the domestic childcare. We see him cooking, we see him cleaning, he's taking care of the children. And that is quite counter-typical in terms of gender. Men are often represented as being the ones that go out and do the work and the financial side of family life. But here he is being represented in a much more kind of domestic fashion. So that is quite a challenge in terms of representations. It's quite unusual, unconventional. However, he's not coping. The house is a state, he can't cook, he's burning himself, and he ends up having to go out and buy a female robot to save the day and to do it for him. So there's this idea that whilst his character is domestic and is supposed to be doing all these chores, he can't cope, he can't do it well enough, and he needs a female character to come in and do it for him. So whilst on the surface his character could be seen as challenging gender stereotypes, if you analyse a bit deeper, it's quite conventional. There are other conventional representations of men in this set episode as well. We see Toby as a teenage boy, kind of obsessed with the female form. He sexualises Anita when he first meets her. He's clearly lusting after her, very intimidated, very nervous, this idea that, you know, he can't control himself around her. And actually we see Joe doing that as well in the scene where, you know, she's walking in front of him, and after he's just purchased her, you see him kind of looking down to admire her bottom. So there's very much this idea that women are sexualized and that men are the ones that do that. We see men in positions of power. So, for example, the physio is very strong physically. He's carrying around his kind of client, the woman. We see the police, men in positions with the police, the detectives. We see Leo, who's kind of performing that typical hero role, trying to rescue Niska and some of the other synths. So there are some fairly typical representations of men in terms of gender in the rest of the episode. If we have a look at representations of age, it would be useful to look at a variety of ages, so like the child characters like Sophie, and then teenagers, as well as adults and older characters too. So Sophie as a child is represented fairly typically. She's seen as quite cute and precocious, but she's also seen as quite vulnerable. So we see Anita carrying her off at the end of the set episode. This idea that, she needs taking care of through the episode. She needs someone to read her a story and to tuck her in and to look after her and keep her away from danger. And then we see her as a victim at the end, a victim of an adult character. So representations of children in this are fairly typical, and that might be to appeal to an adult audience. Parents, a lot of people of that age group who've got their own children might recognise those stereotypes. Teenagers as well, I guess, are represented in a fairly typical way too. So Mattie is seen as quite sarcastic and aggressive, and she hates her parents, and she's quite argumentative. We see her with a gun shooting at synths as well. So this idea of teenagers being kind of detached from society and not wanting to fit in and not feeling like they're part of something. And that is a fairly typical representation of teenagers in the media. And this might reflect the fact that the show is primarily aimed at an adult audience and made by an adult audience as well. So that then makes sense why the adults are represented in positions of power. They're the ones who are policemen and lawyers and detectives and nurses, people who are responsible adults for the most part. So adults are shown as more controlling and in positions of power. However, like many media products, once you get to a certain age, they tend to represent you as helpless and weakless. And we see that in parts of the episode where we see William Hurt's character is obviously older. He's seen as vulnerable. So society treats him as vulnerable in this show. The nurse tries to give him a different synth to look after him. They talk about him needing medication and round-the-clock care. And he's very much seen as a vulnerable old man. He's clearly, got issues with memory and forgetting things about his wife and his life. And so quite a typical representation of older age. The use of stereotypes, therefore, in this programme might be there to appeal to an audience. Some audiences really like stereotypical representations. It makes the story easier to understand because we as an audience can grasp what's going on straight away. Now, Channel 4 has a remit to reflect diversity in its products. And you can see that, if you look in the marketing materials, if you look at the set episode, unlike many other mainstream programmes, this show does have quite a diverse range of characters in terms of ethnicity. There are black characters, there are Asian characters, and not just like one, but several within the episode. It's not necessarily tokenism where you're just including a character for the sake of it. Gemma Chan is basically the lead actress, and she's the one focused on in all the marketing materials. So, clearly there is more ethnic diversity in this programme than perhaps there is in many other programmes. And that may well have appealed to a range of audiences, particularly those who are from ethnic minority backgrounds, who may be fed up with other programmes not necessarily reflecting their culture or their ethnicity. However, if you look at the set episode and which characters play which, role within the narrative, Gemma Chan's character Anita is a synth. She is a servant for the family who are white. If you look at the other characters who are ethnic minority characters, every other character in the set episode who is from an ethnic minority background is a synth. So there's very much this idea that they are enslaved, they are servants, they are there to do the bidding of the primarily white characters who are synth owners. And so I suppose it could have acted as this quite nice allegory for audiences talking about, perhaps the history of race relations. These representations might have, been a teaching moment to sort of discuss how ethnic minorities are often treated this way and certainly historically were represented in this way. But these representations may not have appealed to audiences Because even though they may have cast more diverse actors and they have more diverse characters, essentially the ethnic minority characters are still being represented as being quite submissive and controlled, and the white characters very much have more power and status. And so these representations might not have appealed to everybody. So that was my easy to understand guide to representation in humans. Don't forget to check out my other videos. I've got loads of others that are relevant to A-level media studies, as well as all the theories. And if you've got a question, you can leave a comment below, particularly if there's a video that you would like that I don't already have.